Speech Sister Show. I'm so excited to have our guest on here today. We have Cary Peguero.
Yes.
Yes, she is our Jersey speech language pathologist. She goes by SLP Grad Student on Instagram. We've been following each other for a little bit. I've been stalking her Instagram for a while, and I'm really amazed at what she does. She's obviously a certified speech language pathologist, but she stuck by the name SLP Grad Student, and I'm going to be asking you questions about even why you stayed with the SLP Grad Student and the mission behind the brand. I just think that it's amazing to see BIPOC speech language pathologists doing their thing and continuing to uplift the younger generations after us.
Thank you. Yes. No, definitely. I love this field. I love being able to help.
Yeah, so I did not give you the best introduction. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So, as Melanie had stated, my name is Cary Peguero. I am an SLP based in New Jersey. I am school based and also work part time at a private practice. I found this field by pure luck. And yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at SLP Grad Student and pretty much.
Well, I'm so happy you're here. So the first question I thought of, you said that you found this field by pure luck. Can you tell us a little bit how you got into the industry?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so it is a long story. So basically, when I was in undergrad, whew, I had difficulty figuring out what I wanted to do with my future, right? I went into undergrad as an English major. I got into the major. I was like, I hate this. And then I ended up changing to family and child studies. And then I was also pledging for a sorority, and that just didn't work out. My grades weren't enough to actually declare the major. So then I had to change gears again. And then I went to business for marketing. And so my brother one day ended up talking to me. He's like, "You don't really give me business vibes. You give me more of like helping vibes and things like that, like maybe teaching. You should look into like a career aptitude test." And so that's when I ended up taking it. And speech pathology was one of the options that came up for me to pursue. And so I sat on that and I was thinking about it. And then my sister, who is a registered nurse, she came up to me and she's like, "I think you should look into the speech pathology field." She's like, "I met a speech pathologist and I just really like connected with her. And I just feel like that field would be great for you." So I was like, all right, this is my sign for me to pursue this and go forward with it. So I ended up meeting with the director of the program at my undergrad institution. And I talked to her about the field. I talked to her about what I liked about it and things like that. She allowed me to declare it. And the rest of from there is history. I ended up just learning so much about the field and really becoming engulfed in it and realizing like this is what I could see myself doing.
Well, we're so happy you're here. It seems like you have the best siblings who helped guide you in the direction that was more aligned with you and your goals in life.
Definitely. I'm so thankful for them.
So, why did you stay in the field? Why did you continue to keep going? And what made you create your brand, SLP Grad Student?
So I stayed in the field because of the experiences that I had. Like before I even got into grad school, I was constantly trying to volunteer and find ways to build my resume, immerse myself in the field, get more of a hands-on experience because it's totally different from like learning something in a classroom versus like actually being out in the field and experiencing it. So when I started working with all these different populations, I'm like, wow, I like the difference that I'm making. And so from there, that's what made me stick within the field. And even through grad school, like just the lives that I touched during my internships, like those are things that I take away when I was done with it. And so being that I got into grad school, I felt like at the time it was 2019, the SLP community on Instagram was kind of just starting to flourish.
Mm.
And I just felt like there wasn't enough resources. And I felt like maybe there are other people around that have the same questions that I do. How do you get experience? What should you look for? Like things like that. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to make my own little Instagram page to document my grad school journey, document what works for me. Prior to that, I had like at least I had one friend who was officially in the field in like 2019. And she was someone that I would always talk to about the field. And she was someone who always has guided me in the right direction in this field, extremely like helpful with everything. And so she really motivated me as well to just thinking about her and the support she gave me motivated me to create a page. You know what I mean? Because I'm like, well, if I need this support, I'm sure I'm not the only one who needs that support as well. So that's what pretty much led me to create the SLP grad student page.
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you then is what feedback have you gotten since having the page? And even now?
I've gotten actually a lot of positive feedback on the page. Like just a few days ago, this girl that I had been interacting with a few months back, she messaged me and she's like, hey, like you're the reason why I'm still continuing my SLP journey. She's like, I was able to declare the major and I just want to say thank you so much. That message meant so much to me and it just reminded me about my why as to like why the page is still active, why I'm still doing this, because I could have deleted the page once I graduated and once, I'm no longer an SLP grad student, but I'm like, okay, but my information is still valuable even as an SLP. I don't necessarily have to be a grad student to still run the page. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. So it's meant a lot to me.
Have you thought about changing the name from SLP grad student to something else?
No, I haven't actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it makes you easy to find, and then they're like, "Oh, okay, she's actually certified, so this gives me even more reason to follow her because she actually knows
Yes,
what she's talking about."
definitely, definitely.
So why pediatric speech therapy?
That's a great question, actually. I feel like I've always gravitated towards pediatrics, like even in grad school. Kids have always gravitated towards me as well. And so I just really enjoy like thoroughly connecting with children, being like a positive influence on their life. Like even in the schools, right? Like I work in an area that's very urban. Sometimes you have parents with low social economic status. Sometimes you have parents that aren't even present in the kid's life, right? So
Mhm.
it's like working with children, you can be the person that makes an impact, right? You could be the reason why they're so excited to come to school. My kids that I worked with this year, they were always so excited to come to speech. And that just always reminded me no little thing that we do is too small. You know what I mean? Regardless, we're making an impact in these children's lives. And it's like, those are their little core memories. So down the road, they're going to remember us and they're going to be like, oh my goodness, I remember speech with Miss Melanie. I remember speech with Miss Cary. It was such a good time, you know?
Yeah, that makes me think about when I was living in Washington, D.C. So I was on the East Coast for a little bit too.
Oh,
And
nice.
yes. And so I got to do my externship at a Title I school. And yeah, the kids really did have rough lives outside of school. So school was like their place of refuge.
Yeah.
That was their place to be able to play and everything. And I mean, this does bring me to my next question for you. One thing, so just a little bit about me. I had no plans on being, first, I had no plans on being a speech pathologist. And
Wow.
then thank God I fell into the field. I was going to do broadcast journalism. Long story short, my dad was like, we need something with a good return on the investment. And
Yeah.
so thankfully, the chair of the department came and talked about speech pathology, and I fell into that. And I told myself I was only going to work with adults. I only wanted to work with adults. And then I said, God laughed and put me in a pre-K through third grade school for my first externship.
Wow.
So, of course, I had to deal a lot with behavior management. That was my weak spot. Like, I mean, I still don't want to say that I'm perfect at it. I'm really not. But
Mhm.
do you have any advice to give when it comes to behavior management, especially at a Title I school?
Oh my goodness. That I'm still learning that as well. Like it's kind of just identifying the triggers for the kids, right? Like today, for example, I had a kid that I don't work with, right? My colleague works with her, but she tends to have these meltdowns and just kind of goes a little bit crazy in the classroom and they'll take her out of the room and they'll bring her to the child study team office. And nobody was available to work with her today. And so I literally sat with her and I just kept her in an area that was controlled where she wouldn't hurt herself. So definitely if you have a kid that's like having a meltdown, keep them in an area that's controlled. Like I said, where they can't hurt themselves, kind of talk them through it. validate their emotions. Okay, I understand you're upset. What happened wasn't the best. It's okay to be upset, but let's talk about it. Or if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay. How can I help you to calm down and relax a little bit more? And eventually she started throwing in this piece of paper that she ripped, which it was like a paper we printed that said testing, do not enter. So I was like totally okay with that. So I was like, yeah, throw that paper, girl. You want to throw it on the floor, throw it. You want to step on it, step on it. Like, do whatever you want with that paper, you know?
Yeah.
And so eventually, like, she started warming up, and then, you know, I got her to sit down. I gave her a piece of paper, and she started like communicating through the piece of paper because she was still like upset. And then eventually, like, she drew a cat, and I was like, do you want to teach me to draw a cat? Because, like, I remember hearing from my colleagues, like, them saying, oh, yeah, like, she likes to draw. So I was like, do you want to teach me how to draw a cat? So just finding ways to help the kids calm down, finding what they like, what they don't like, maybe giving them options and things like that. I'm still learning, though, honestly, with controlling behaviors. It's not easy.
It's not, but I really appreciate what you said about pretty much just meeting the child where they're at and validating their emotions and validating where they're coming from and letting them have their moment. Because yes, we could use that as a teaching moment, as a speech therapy moment of, okay, let's learn how to communicate our feelings, which I feel like a lot of speech pathologists might try to do that. And of course, it depends on the kid and the situation. But thank God you used your intuition. You're like, look, this kid really just needs a space to just go all out, throw papers around. That's fine. It makes me think about one child who his teacher was very tough. He's in a self-contained classroom, and his teacher was very, very tough. And I went in there, and the teacher was being tough with him, and he was so mad. His face turned red, and he started tearing up paper. And I'm just like, let it out, baby, let it out. And the teacher was laughing at me. She was cracking up. She was like, but I'm like, no, really, like, just let it. We can get back to the lesson. It's fine. And I really also appreciate how you built rapport with that child too. So like that's gonna go a really long way. And now you're probably going to be their favorite being in the whole entire school.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah, no, definitely. Because, like, the way that I try to approach things now is like, okay, I know I'm an adult, but how would I want to be approached if I was a kid? Like, I would want my feelings validated. I would want to be heard if, you know, I was in the mood to talk about what I was going through, you know? So I just kind of try to take that approach while also, you know, still kind of like keeping the area and the situation as controlled as I can.
Yes. So let's get into a little bit about your journey as a Latina speechy. Would you say that it's any different from any other members of the BIPOC community or even our white colleagues? Did you go through any specific experiences that you'd like to share?
I feel like, yes, it is different in a sense from other backgrounds in our field, right? Because as a Latina, like, so many more things are expected of us, like even in the grad school aspect of it all. I remember being in an internship, and I was at a skilled nursing facility, and I was like the only person there that spoke Spanish. So being that I was the only person there that spoke Spanish, I always had to communicate with the patients that only spoke Spanish. I was there as a translator. I had to like start making the skilled nursing facility resources. I made low-tech AAC boards for the nonverbal Spanish speaking population that was there and things along those lines. So I feel like, yeah, you know, there are certain things that we carry more of a load of, a higher expectation, because besides having to treat people that just speak English, we have to treat also people who speak Spanish, right? So it can be tough. And even, you know, in my grad school experience, I was one of two girls that were Spanish in the program that I was in. So even then, you have this desire to succeed, desire not to be looked down upon just because you're of a different background from the rest of your cohort, right? So yeah, I feel like it was tough being a grad student and then trying to manage also like living in a new state and things along those lines as well.
What state was your grad program in?
In Utah.
Oh, wow. So what was that cultural difference like?
It was definitely very different. I feel like I didn't have too much of a culture shock, but it was just like adjusting to different things. Like, right, in Utah, everything closes on Sundays. And I'm not used to that because in Jersey, everything is open on Sundays until like 11 p.m., right? So if you want to go to the supermarket, you can still go. But in Utah, like the only thing that was open was like Walmart, and that's because it's a big chain, right?
Yeah.
Just learning about what's socially appropriate and what's not socially appropriate, the different terms that they had. In Jersey, we call soda soda, but in Utah, they call soda pop, or like even lollipops. We call them lollipops here in Jersey. In Utah, they call them suckers. So like learning all of those things and like trying to use the correct verbiage when I'm working with my younger clients while I was in grad school, that was something else that I had to really learn how to navigate.
So that does bring me to my next question. Let's talk about the microaggressions. So there are some different types of microaggressions. I'm going to go ahead and read them. And I'm going to try to paraphrase. This is coming from Sue and colleagues from Columbia University. So the first one is micro insults. That's often unconscious in their behavioral or verbal remarks or comments that are a bit rude, they're insensitive, and they demean a person's racial heritage or identity. There's micro assaults, which are often cautious. They pretty much know that they're doing it and they're explicitly racial denigrations. And then there's environmental microaggressions, which is at the macro level, which is straight up racial assaults, insults, and invalidations, which are manifested on systemic and environmental levels. So, with all of that considered, are there any sorts of microaggressions that you've experienced that stick out in your mind?
Well, one of the microaggressions that I have experienced was actually being told, like, oh, you're Hispanic? You don't look like you're Hispanic. And I'm just like, okay, well, what does a Hispanic person look like? Because, you know, we come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. That's like one of the things that definitely stood out to me, throughout my journey.
That I remember before we were talking, and so you mentioned how you're like, well, I really actually haven't noticed any microaggressions.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me feel that you stand really tall and you just kind of move through the field without thinking about differences or anything like that. You just keep moving, you do your job and you do your work. Would you, for anyone who might even, for example, be suffering from imposter syndrome, do you have any advice to give us when it comes to that?
Well, for the imposter syndrome, definitely. I mean, I've been there. I've felt that. I've done that. You know, it's like you're in the field for a reason. You've made it this far for a reason. Don't let your mind trick you into feeling like you're not good enough because you bring something to the table that nobody else brings, right? You bring your uniqueness, you bring your experiences that nobody else has experienced but you, right? So, like, when it comes to imposter syndrome, you just have to mentally remind yourself, I'm doing the right thing. This is why I'm here. And if you feel as though, hey, I need to work on this, then maybe reach out to like your supervisor, ask questions. There's ways to navigate that imposter syndrome. Even with me being, I mean, I finished my CFY in November, right? So I'm still pretty new to the field and I'll still have moments where I feel it, but I'll always check in with my coworker who's a more seasoned SLP. I'll text my old supervisor and be like, hey, am I doing this right? Like things like that. But I'm aware that this is a feeling that we do tend to experience in the field, like a feeling of imposter syndrome, a feeling of just not being good enough or not feeling like we're competent enough. But we're given all the tools and they're just in our brain somewhere. We just got to find them, right?
Yes. And I like how you think about people are also resources too. So as we're talking, I'm just like, this is why it's so important to network and to at least
Mhm.
have that network in your back pocket. So even if you aren't feeling imposter syndrome right now, or everything is fine and gravy and you're in a nice honeymoon stage right now, keep networking. So that way, when you do have those lows, you have somebody to reach out to. So there's imposter syndrome. Are there any other challenges that you've noticed your audience reaching out to you about to help them?
Yeah, definitely feeling like they're not good enough for the field, feeling like, hey, I have the grades, but I don't have the experience, or vice versa. I have the experience, but I don't have the grades. Like, Listen, I got into grad school with a 2.9 GPA, right? I worked as much as I could to build my experience because I was always like following little forums. And I know there's one forum that they say you shouldn't follow when you're like applying to grad school. Off the top of my head, I can't think about it. But like, I would always just follow those things and even just follow like my other fellow SLP friends that I went to school with. And that was just something for me that was like toxic, right? Because prior to being in the field, I always felt like, well, my friends are in the field. Why aren't I in the field? They're doing their thing. Why can't I just do my thing? Kind of remembering like, again, like you're here for a reason. Don't give up on your dreams, right? I remember also even prior to being accepted into grad school, I had to take a year off. And that was a tough year because, again, I saw my friends on social media going to grad school, living their best lives and pursuing their dreams. And I'm just like, well, I'm not good enough right now. And is this even something that is worth me pursuing because I'm not getting accepted into anywhere? And I really just took that year off to really work on me, work on like my experience and just pray. I'm like very much like a firm believer, like what's meant to be yours is going to be yours. You just got to have faith. You got to work towards it. I ended up getting accepted to one grad school during like my year off. And that one grad school was like, they had rejected me initially. And then they called me on New Year's of, I think it was like 2019 or something. And they're like, hey, you're accepted, but we need you to move across the country by Monday. And New Year's was like on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just like, okay, it's a Wednesday. I literally have Thursday, Friday to really figure things out and then move across the country by Monday. And I remember just crying about it and just feeling like I don't know what to do. I don't want to give up this opportunity. Like, this is something that I really want. But I ended up taking it as a sign, like, you know what? This is my sign that I'm meant to be accepted into grad school. This is meant to be my journey, but just not this opportunity. You know, so another opportunity is going to fall on my lap. I'm going to do what I can to make it fall on my lap. But I'm just taking this as my sign from the universe, God, like whatever higher being you believe in, like I'm taking that as my sign that this is what I'm meant to do and this is my journey.
That really makes me think about how a lot of times rejection is redirection.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so I'm a firm believer in that too. And I remember I got into one graduate school. I applied to three. One of them was my undergrad institution. So I got back into my undergrad institution. And yeah, and I'm like, honestly, thank God they took me back. And I took a year off and worked in hospitality. But like during my year off, I was like, well, maybe let me challenge myself again. I really wasn't good at test taking. So I hated the GRE. I barely even looked at my score. Right. That was probably what tanked it, like what affected it. So I'm like, well, let me go back to the drawing board and just study again, apply again. And then I go to the school's iLab. It's pretty much like the computer lab because I was still in DC. So I go to the iLab and I was talking to one of my old classmates from undergrad and saying, oh, yeah, I want to get back into speech pathology, blah, blah, blah. And someone who was already in the grad program, she went to Johns Hopkins for undergrad. So she's completely unbiased. She went to the grad program and she walked up to me and was like, oh, did you say you wanted to do speech? I said, yes. And I asked her, I said, be honest, what is this program like? And he said, well, every program has their pros and cons, but then she really stopped herself and asked, well, what do you want to be a speech pathologist for? She asked me my why. That was like the first time I was ever like asked. And I told her, I said, well, I really want to help Black and brown kids in the education system. And she said, honestly, this school is for you. It's Howard, it's an HBCU. She was like, this school is for you. If you go to these other institutions that you're trying to get into, you might have one class on sociolinguistics or multiculturalism, but at Howard, it's like ingrained. So I do recommend that you come here. And I believe that was God. Like, what are the odds that that person was there in earshot of me talking about it and everything? And I don't think I would be where I am today or would have the knowledge that I have today if that didn't happen. So
Yeah. No, I agree. I feel like certain experiences mold you, and certain experiences are definitely like signs for you to take. So that was like really awesome though. Like she just popped up out of nowhere and told you to do it.
yeah, she was like a fairy godmother, like who came and flew down and helped me out. She actually lives in New York, so I don't know,
Oh
maybe
wow.
and conventions sometimes. But I did
Yeah.
want to ask what your graduate school experience was like.
My graduate school experience was very interesting. I have a few close friends from grad school now, so I'm so thankful for them. But like initially, it was very cliquey. It was majority girls. There was only like two guys in the program, and so it was organized by, you had the popular clique, so they stood together, right? And then you had like just kind of, I guess, the more religious people kind of stuck together too. So there was that clique. And then there was more so like the minority groups, which was me, my close SLP bestie. She's from Pakistan. So me and her were stuck together. Um, as well as another girl who, she was Filipino. So we all stuck together. And we were, I guess, looking at it now, we're like the minority group in the
Yeah.
program. And then everybody else just did their own thing. So my grad school experience in that sense was very interesting because I found it a little bit hard to connect with certain people because we all came from such different backgrounds, right? Some of us came from very privileged backgrounds and others came from backgrounds that it's like, I'm here because I'm on loans and I'm just hoping and praying that everything goes right for me, and I'm from a middle class family and things like that. So in that sense it was very interesting, and I definitely stuck to like my two girls, but then like as the program continued, I found myself feeling like, okay, if these two girls are hanging out together, I can't sit there and be upset, right? I can't feel like I'm out of the loop. So then that kind of forced me to step out of my comfort zone and start really connecting with people and making those meaningful memories with people other than the two girls that I was always with. So from there, I ended up connecting, and they really made my journey worth it because without them, I don't know where I'd be. They were definitely my backbone. We would always go out Friday, just hang out and just be silly, like young adults.
Before we leave, there are a few pressing questions I want to ask you. A lot of people, especially when it comes to like when they're in a clinical fellowship year and when they're in grad school, really struggle with networking. And
Mm-hmm.
I really feel it takes a lot of authenticity to network and just stepping out of your comfort zone. One thing I
Yeah.
noticed about you, Cary, is how authentic you just are. Like, I remember we didn't know each other really at all. We just followed each other, and you had a minor typo on your post. Like, it really was no big deal, but I'm like,
Yes.
changed meaning. So I reached out to you, and you were just so lighthearted about it. You were so lighthearted and friendly, and even went back to the post and you're like, "Hey y'all, I made a mistake," instead of just completely taking the post down.
Yeah.
So, like, what would you say about being authentic? Like, what does that look like for you, and how can you? I guess any advice you would have for the speechy listening to this, like, how can I step into my own skin?
I feel like you just always have to remember where you come from, right? Like for me, I came from a background that it's like, if you hear where I'm from in Jersey, you're kind of just like, oh, that's a rough part of Jersey. Just always remembering where you come from. For me, as I said, from a rough part of Jersey, and that is really my why. I grew up in an education system that it's broken. Let's be very transparent there. And so just being able to come out of that, I am already a success story. And then just thinking about like my parents. My dad came here from the Dominican Republic with nothing but a dollar and a dream. And so I do what I do for my parents because I want to be able to give back to them as much as they gave to me. And that is what allows me to really like step into my true self and just that authenticity. Like just always remembering my roots and remembering to just remain humble, because what God and what the universe gives, it also can take, right?
Yeah,
So
that
just
part.
always sitting in that gratitude. I have moments in this field too where I'm just like, I don't know, this field is a tough field. But then I remember I worked so hard to get here. This is what I wanted. This is what I spent my nights crying for. And so I have to just sit there and remind myself, like, no, I'm in the middle of one of my dreams right now. And it could get rough, but there's better times than bad times.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That makes me think, you didn't say this explicitly, but it really just makes me think about our ancestors and the strength that we get just from acknowledging why we do this. It's just like, for me, we just celebrated Juneteenth and I took the day to rest. I'm like, my ancestors would want me to rest. They would want me to rest today. They would not want me working.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know your parents are just like beaming from ear to ear. You got to show them this episode too. I'm sure it'll bring tears to their eyes.
Definitely.
Well, Cary, before we go, tell us about your podcast.
Oh, yes. So my podcast is SLP Grad Student on Spotify. It basically came up out of nowhere, right? I thought about how, like, during my commute to work, I really listen to podcasts, and I'm like, well, instead of doing YouTube videos that might require editing and stuff like that, which I'm not that good at, I can just do a podcast and it's literally just my voice, right? And so that's what brought up the podcast and just the different topics that I want to talk about. Like, yeah, I can make a post about it, but I feel like in a post on Instagram, you can't really be as detailed as you can in an episode of a podcast. So that's what brought up the podcast. And on the podcast, I'll talk about different things. I'll talk about my experience in the field, my experience in grad school, my experience with tough supervisors, tough friends in the cohort, and things like that. I really try to just talk about experiences that can be applied to everyone in this field and our universal experiences.
Yes. Well, how can people find you? I know that the podcast is called SLP Grad Student Podcast, right?
Yes.
Okay. Is it on Apple too, or right now only on Spotify?
I believe it's on Apple as well. Yes, it is.
Okay. How can we find you after this show?
After the show, you can find me on Instagram at SLP Grad Student.
Yes. We can slide in your DMs, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Cary, for coming on the show. Thank you so much for everyone who attended this episode and everyone who's watching the replay. Join us next episode. We are going to have Jenna Castro-Casbon from The Independent Clinician telling us about what it's like to be an LGBTQ entrepreneur. Until then, I'll see y'all on Saturday. Thank you, Cary.
Thank you, Melanie.